The definition of emo is something that's been thrown around and debated for years now, maybe even decades. There's people that will cringe at the idea of some bands being considered emo, and on the opposite end of that, I think the term gets thrown around so much that I've even heard new metal bands like Trapped and Evanescence being considered emo. Regardless, the 2000s were a time when emo and pop punk sort of combined and joined forces and made their way into the mainstream, to the point where the two genres essentially became the same thing. To some people, emo was more about apparel and the clothes that you wore, the black mascara on your eyes. To me, it's not quite that simple. It's more nuanced than that. I try my best not to let nostalgia play a role here because honestly, nostalgia depresses me anyway, so it wasn't that hard to completely eliminate that. With all that being said, these aren't the only good albums from that era. These are just the 15 that sort of still catch my attention as a 30-year-old. So let's get into it. The Walking Wounded by Bayside. Bayside was a band that I was absolutely infatuated with in high school. Their first two albums, Sirens and Condolences and Self-Titled, are filled to the brim with self-loathing lyrics and gloomy guitar melodies. For their third album, Bayside stepped up their game in a big way, evolving with complex song structures and more thought-provoking lyrical content. The Walking Wounded feels like a band thriving at their creative peak, while not caring if anyone likes it or not. Luckily, it's still largely considered the band's best work to date. The Walking Wounded is Bayside's masterpiece that they still have not been able to match. Trainwreck by Boys Night Out. Leaning more into the post-hardcore aspects of emo, Boys Night Out managed to create ambitious and exciting songs throughout their run as a band. On their second album, Trainwreck, they created a borderline rock opera. The concept of Trainwreck is that a man murders his wife in his sleep and slowly loses his mind through the course of an album. Regardless if you want to follow the story or not, these songs run into each other perfectly. Boys Night Out has always had a knack for making fairly heavy songs feel relatively poppy, and Trainwreck is no exception. When it comes to personal preference, I actually prefer their self-titled album, but as a creative statement, Trainwreck is undoubtedly their most grand and acclaimed album. On Letting Go by Circa Survive. With the exception of maybe one other band on here, Circa Survive has probably had the most consistent career out of all the bands. All 6 of their albums have either been good or great, meaning that their sound has arguably held up the best out of any emo band from the mid-2000s. On their sophomore release, On Letting Go, the band took everything good from their first release and multiplied it by about 20. Already having a very distinct sound with prog rock influences, Circa Survive allowed their creative juices to flow throughout On Letting Go to exciting and emotional heights. Vocalist Anthony Green's unique vocal style elevates the spacey elements of the music while adding a powerful sincerity to it. Circa Survive has made a living off making albums that aren't all that different from one another, but why try to fix something when it's so obviously not broken? Good Apollo, I'm Burning Star 4, Volume 1, From Fear Through the Eyes of Madness by Coheed and Cambria. It's really hard to explain what this album meant to me at the age of 15. I can remember at the time MTV had a feature on their website where you could preview an entire album a week before it was released. For whatever reason, I decided to sample Good Apollo. I really liked what I heard, so I decided to go out to Walmart the very next day and pick it up. What followed after was several weeks and maybe even months of me being absolutely obsessed with Coheed and Cambria. Honestly, I think I may have even failed a couple classes because I was more focused on listening to this album than doing my homework. Fast forward to today and I still honestly think that this album is pretty great. In retrospect, I think I prefer their debut album, The Second Stage Turbine Blade, but the power of Good Apollo is undeniably still there. In some ways, I kind of think that this was Coheed and Cambria's last great release, but it would be asking a lot of any band to try and top this mammoth of an album. The Ugly Organ by Cursive. Cursive's The Ugly Organ is sort of unarguably the best album featured on here. Coincidentally, they're also my favorite band, so there's a little bit of bias. I actually prefer their 2006 album, Happy Hollow, but to me, that's absolutely not an emo album. The Ugly Organ was their last album that I truly felt like could slide into the emo genre. With that being said, Cursive never really fit in with any of the other bands from the genre at the time, more so fitting in with the indie rock and noise rock crowd. Prior to this album, Cursive made a career of making emotionally fueled albums, consistently wearing their hearts on their sleeves while delivering uniquely structured rock songs. With The Ugly Organ, they chose to make something a little bit more atmospheric and thematic. There's a dreary and uneasy feeling all throughout the album, having a borderline gothic aesthetic at times. In 2015, I was lucky enough to catch the entire album live. I'd be lying if I said that some tears weren't shed. If you're new to Cursive, I highly recommend every single album that they have released. The Mother, the Mechanic, and the Path by Early November. Undeniably the Early November's magnum opus, The Mother, the Mechanic, and the Path shows the band at their most musically diverse. This is yet another album I purchased on a whim. I was vaguely aware that it was a triple album, but had no idea what it was exactly that I was getting myself into. Before purchasing the album, the only song I had heard was their single Hair, which is a quirky, light-hearted pop song. Soon after listening to the album, I found that there is literally not another song on the album that sounds like Hair. My favorite of the 3 discs is undeniably The Mechanic, which almost sounds like a completely different band. It focuses more on acoustic folk and even southern rock songs. The Early November take a huge chance here, and honestly, they hit it out of the park. To this day, this is still my favorite material from the band. Wonderland by Forgive Durden. Even though they were on the same record label as Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco, Forgive Durden never really managed to break into the mainstream. However, this is partially understandable, considering that their debut album, Wonderland, is a concept album that literally refuses to stick to any sort of formula. In high school, I was fairly certain that I was the only kid who listened to this band. Their exciting song structures mixed with meticulous musicianship caught my attention almost immediately. For Forgive Durden, it was practically nothing for them to just completely change their song halfway through it, altering the mood entirely. Forgive Durden only released one more album after this and doubled down on their artistic integrity by releasing a full-blown musical in Rosia's Shadow, a musical. While I prefer Wonderland, I still highly recommend Rosia's Shadow because there's literally nothing else like it. Volcano by Gatsby's American Dream. Similar to Forgive Durden, Gatsby's American Dream refused to stick to a formula. Come to think of it, Gatsby's American Dream had a major influence on Forgive Durden's sound, as well as other bands of the time. At the time, they were sort of notorious for having songs that lacked choruses, so much so that they made an entire EP about this very thing. Featuring only 2 songs over 3 minutes, Gatsby's managed to fit as much as they could into incredibly short tracks. In that sense, their progressive rock influences allowed them to be as hectic as they wanted. Lyrically, Volcano has a loose concept revolving around the theme of human emotions and how they're similar to a volcano. The band also uses their literary knowledge to excellent use by having several references to classic literature. Their entire discography is highly unique and diverse, ranging from straight-up punk rock to indie rock to even progressive rock. Ultimately, they played a pretty huge role in me being a musician and the way that I approach playing the guitar. Futures by Jimmy Eat World. Jimmy Eat World played a major part in breaking emo into the mainstream, especially with their 2001 release Bleed American, but it's their album Futures that really made an impact in my life. The funny thing is that I bought both of these albums at nearly the same time. I recognized that Bleed American had more immediate appeal to it, but Futures always felt more complex and meaningful. In a lot of ways, it has much more in common with their breakout 1999 album Clarity, which is widely known as one of the greatest emo albums of all time. This is yet again another album that I was lucky enough to catch the anniversary tour for, and it was absolutely nothing short of magical. Sometimes I still catch myself listening to Futures and being transported back to the way that I felt at the ages of 14 and 15. Voices by Matchbook Romance. Arguably one of the most forgotten about albums of its era, Voices by Matchbook Romance was a daring reinvention of a band that may have ultimately killed their career. At the time, it was pretty common for emo bands to adopt a relatively darker sound. Bands like Good Charlotte and The Used approached this in a fairly effective way, but none of them could match what Matchbook Romance did. Matchbook Romance tossed out their harmless but unremarkable sound for a daring and dark sound, leaning more into the progressive sides of emo. It's not only darker, but it's substantially heavier, featuring more guitar solos and borderline deafening drums. It's really unfortunate that Voices still hasn't received the recognition that it deserves. Considering how much of an artistic risk it was, I think it paid off beautifully. Commit This to Memory by Motion City Soundtrack. As an adult, Commit This to Memory is probably the album that I revisit the most out of all the albums featured here. It's kind of hard to explain, but it just hits different as an adult. The sometimes self-deprecating lyrics manage to clash perfectly with the otherwise upbeat-sounding music. As a whole, Motion City Soundtrack does an excellent job of being relatively sarcastic while never losing their relatability along the way. On Commit This to Memory, they hit their stride as a band, making a timely and extremely enjoyable album that still manages to hit hard 15 years later. To me, this is what ideal pop-punk should sound like. Commit This to Memory is ultimately an extraordinarily personal album that never feels too bleak thanks to fun and imaginative music. The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. In 2006 and 2007, My Chemical Romance was very likely the biggest musical act in the world. With the release of their third album, The Black Parade, My Chemical Romance transcended the idea of what emo could do by catapulting their music into the ears of literally anyone with a car radio or television. This is pretty funny because for how absurdly popular this album is, it's actually incredibly good. Suddenly people who initially mocked emo were now rocking out to The Black Parade with absolutely zero shame. Since its release, one could make a case that no other rock album since has been able to dominate the mainstream quite like it did. Even on their follow-up album, Danger Days, The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, they created something entirely different from their prior body of work, for better or for worse. It's always an exciting event when new music is dropped by My Chemical Romance. Let's just hope that something like that will happen eventually again. In Reverie by Saves the Day. In Reverie is the album that almost ended Saves the Day. Stylistically, it was a major departure from the band's previous sound, and it had a relatively difficult time getting airplay. Shortly after the album was released, their record label, Dreamwork Records, was absorbed by Interscope, and the band was dropped. The reason why I'm saying all this is because I actually think that In Reverie is Save the Day's greatest album by a landslide. Vocalist Chris Conley's vocals changed drastically from the prior record, Stay What You Are, taking on a more relaxed vocal technique, rather than the often intense vocal delivery that had been established before. To me, it fit in perfectly with the more nuanced musicianship and sonic textures in the production. Musically, In Reverie has more in common with a Steely Dan album than a textbook emo album of its era. To this day, In Reverie is the first album that comes to my mind when someone brings up Saves the Day. Is a Real Boy by Say Anything. Say Anything's Is a Real Boy feels like an hour-long identity crisis with frequent panic attacks. Vocalist Max Bemis literally writes his feelings on paper with absolutely zero shame. The overall manic nature of the album can feel emotionally exhausting at times, but the themes and tone shifts make it an incredibly memorable album still to this day. While I do think that this album is a masterpiece of the genre, I also highly recommend their follow-up double album In Defense of the Genre, which is 90 minutes of everything you could ever love about Say Anything. A City by the Light Divided by Thursday. Last but certainly not least, A City by the Light Divided by Thursday is a beautifully dark and daring creative obstacle for the band. Thursday took on a more raw production quality, establishing a bit of a wall of sound aesthetic. While certainly not ignoring their post-hardcore traits, Thursday found a perfect use for more guitar effects to add textures to the overall heaviness in their music. Similar to Saves the Day, I believe Thursday lost a lot of fans with A City by the Light Divided, but while losing fans, they also gained a ton of new ones, such as me. I know it's a controversial opinion, but I actually prefer the second half of Thursday's career compared to the first half. As someone who loves essentially all things shoegaze, Thursday's moodier sound just hits me harder. My favorite album of theirs, No Devolution, further explores the elements of A City by the Light Divided to even greater effect. If you neglected some of Thursday's later work, I highly recommend that you go back and give it another chance because it's absolutely glorious. So those are 15 emo albums that I still feel like really hold up to today's standards. Is there anything that I left off? I mean, there are quite a few other albums that I still feel like are really good, but they just didn't appeal to me as much as a 30-year-old. Let me know what you thought in the comment section below, hit that subscribe button, and thank you for watching.